Welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Monday, February 24th, 2025. On Mondays, we look into mathematics and statistics, everyone's favorite subject. And so today we're going to actually take a look into finances. And we'll start with minimum wage. Math and statistics, as you know, are fundamental to our everyday experiences, regardless of whether we claim to love or to hate math. And if you're in that crowd that supposedly hates math, are you also in the crowd that hates money? I don't know that many people in the latter group, the money haters. I rarely hear people say, I hate money. I hate having money. I hate everything about money. In fact, here, just take my money. I can't think of anyone I personally know that hates money that way precisely. I do, of course, know many people who hate corporate greed or hate banks' predatory lending practices, or who in general, hate the global capitalist system that dominates the world. But I don't equate any of that necessarily with a pure hatred of money per se. It's a fascinating issue to consider when we start speculating on the nature of the value of money and what money represents. And I'll deal with that issue in due course, but not today. Instead, I just want to talk about the money that you currently make, or maybe that you made when you first started working, more precisely. Your earnings, and add a bit of mathematical and historical perspective to all of these issues. So do you remember your first job, your first paying job, exactly what you earned? What was your hourly wage, for example? And what's a good paying job? Or what was a good paying job back then? Or was it just a minimum wage job that you worked at? Was it enough to live on in light of your circumstances at the time? I imagine that for most of us, we would have secured our first paying job, usually as adolescents or as teenagers, not counting those of us who grew up on farms. And if you were living with your parents, you might not have had too many basic expenses to worry about, or for which you were personally responsible. In some cases, though, young people work and actually do directly contribute to the household finances. I remember a case of a 16-year-old that I was coaching in basketball some years ago, and he was missing practice a little bit too much. And I finally, talked to him about this, said, "What's going on?" And he said he was working a couple of jobs. And I said, "Well, is it really necessary for you to work a couple of jobs?" And he explained, well, yes and no. He didn't actually have to work that much because his mother did work as well, and she made enough money for him and his brother. But they lived in a really kind of rundown area, a dangerous area in Rexdale, Ontario. And I'll never forget this. He said, "I just want to be able to make enough money." This is a 16-year-old. "I just want to be able to make enough money so I can buy my mom a house and help move her out of here." I remember thinking, wow, I wasn't worried about that exactly when I was 16, but, different time, different place, different set of circumstances. Anyway, so it was back in the 1970s then that I earned my first money from a paper route, pretty conventional job for a preteen or early teen. But I secured my first honest to God paycheck position or job back in 1976. As a 14-year-old, I started working on a special permit because you needed a special permit if you were under the age of 16. And I worked at Bob's Big Boy as a dishwasher for a minimum wage of $2.30 per hour in Fairfax, Virginia. I also remember having to punch in using a time clock. In fact, it's the only job, as I think that I can remember, where I had to actually punch in with the time clock. And you punched in, obviously, at the start of each shift, and then you punched out at the end. But here's a little trick that I learned almost immediately. A coworker explained that we were technically being paid in increments of 6 minutes, or in other words, 10% of each hour. What did that mean? Well, if your shift started at 8 a.m., you should punch in at 7:59 a.m. And if you did that, you'd be credited with working from 7:54 to 8 a.m. All right, now recall, I'm earning $2.30 per hour. So how much money would I make for that extra tenth of an hour? Do the math. So a tenth of $2.30. Right, an additional 23 cents. So if I punched in at 8 a.m. on the nose, then my first chunk of time would be from 8 to 8:06. So the point was that, I always tried to punch in a minute or two before the start of the shift. And if I did that, it'd make the extra 23 cents. Same thing at the end of the shift. Never punch out before the hour that, when you were scheduled to work. And if you already passed the hour, then wait a few minutes to punch out late, and you'd earn an extra 23 cents in my case. So, in short, I learned the value of punching the clock out just a minute before my official shift started. And if I worked a full shift, I'd try to punch out just a little bit late. And so instead of earning $18.40 for an 8-hour shift, I typically earn $18.86 instead. And so that's almost a half dollar more for a day's work. And that was a big deal back in 1976 to a 14-year-old. By the way, I also learned about the capitalist system from my employer, one of my managers at the time, Nancy. She was the main manager at the Bob's Big Boy. She was the head manager, and then there were a number of assistant managers. Really nice woman for reasons that I won't get into today, but she really helped me out as a youngster. And she explained to me back then that a glass of Coke sold for 35 cents back in the day, again in 1976, but it returned a profit of about 1,000%. And I remember saying incredulously, "No way, how could that be?" Based on she explained, Nancy, that is, she replied with something along the lines of, "Joe, it's basic math. It cost us about 3.5 cents per glass based on the wholesale prices for the soda fountain machine. And so we've costed the drinks to be about 10 times as much. And that's why we charge 35 cents a glass." And I remember being amazed that it only cost 3.5 cents per glass, but they were charging 35 cents. So that was my earliest exposure and understanding of the capitalist profit motive. Now, to be fair, I don't think she was factoring in the real costs, which would have included all of the infrastructure costs associated with the restaurant, payroll cost, maintenance cost of the soda machine, insurance cost, taxes paid, and so on. Maybe I'm wrong about that because I didn't follow up with more probing questions. I was just, again, amazed that they were charging 35 cents and it supposedly only cost them 3.5 cents. But the bottom line is I learned that restaurants and retailers everywhere have to charge prices sufficiently high to turn a profit. Capitalism 101. So I worked as a dishwasher for the first month, and apparently I did a pretty good job. It actually started with the very first day. As a 14-year-old, I had a special work permit that restricted when I could work and how late I could work and for how many hours per shift. And so that first Saturday, I was supposed to work from noon to 8 p.m. Standard 8-hour shift, and I wasn't supposed to or allowed to work past 8 p.m. So what happened, though, was 8 p.m. rolled around, and the restaurant was still quite busy, and no one came in to relieve me. It wasn't necessarily a case of Lucy and Ethel working in the chocolate factory, but it was still pretty busy, and I was the only one there doing the dishes that evening. So 8 p.m. rolled around, and I just kept working. Finally, things started to slow down after about an hour. The evening rush was over, and the restaurant was thinning out, and I had everything more or less under control. Around 9:45 p.m., or nearly 2 hours after my shift was supposed to be finished, the assistant manager on duty came in and looked astonished and said something like, "Joe, what are you still doing here?" Well, I was nervous and tired and 14, of course, so I blurted out something like, "I don't know, I'm just working. The dishes kept coming." And so he was a bit agitated and said something like, "You're not supposed to work more than 8 hours, right?" And I said, "Well, I know, but I didn't know what to do. No one else was here and no one said anything." And I'll never forget his response, which was something along the lines of, "Well, you're supposed to come and tell me when your shift is over and be sure to punch out on the time clock on time." And I remember thinking to myself, even at that young age, wait, so you're saying it's my fault that I worked too long? But instead, I just mumbled something nervously like, oh, I didn't know that, head down sheepishly or whatever. And of course, being Catholic, I remember feeling a bit guilty and wondering if it really was my fault. Anyway, it turns out that Nancy, the aforementioned manager, got on the assistant manager's case for the misunderstanding. And I came out of that stinky dishwashing corner with the conveyor belt where we had the dishwashing machine smelling like the proverbial rose. We did the heavy pots and pans by hand, by the way, and instead we had these big trays for the dishes and the glasses and the silverware. Anyway, how did I know that I came out smelling like a rose? Because within a month, I was promoted to cook, along with a hefty 20 cents per hour raise. So, the moral of the story, work hard, do your job, show up on time, do a little bit extra without complaining, and you too could end up being promoted to becoming one of the youngest chefs in Bob's Big Boy history. I was quite thrilled to be a 14-year-old chef making $2.50 an hour within a month of my tenure there, and that's a full 20 cents above minimum wage at the time. By the way, how does that minimum wage compare with today's minimum wage? We have to convert using the CPI index, adjusting for inflation, and it also depends on where you live. But the minimum wage of $2.30 an hour in 1976 would translate into $12.84 today in U.S. dollars. Turns out that in Virginia, the state has adjusted the minimum wage based on a set formula to $12.41 per hour. So it's pretty comparable. I really can't complain in that sense. And with my $2.50 hour salary, $2.50 per hour wage, that's almost $14 per hour in real wages today in Virginia. So, in effect, I was really living large, making good money, and living off the welfare, of course, of my parents' family home. So I had nothing to complain about. And then I think about 6 months later, I got another quarter raise, and then another quarter after that. So within a year or so, I was making $3 an hour. Again, from my little perspective, I thought this is fantastic. I ended up working at Bob's Big Boy for about 2 years, by the way. So anyway, it's interesting to note that some states currently in the U.S. have, continued to pay the federal minimum of $7.25 per hour. From Utah to Oklahoma to Wisconsin to Pennsylvania to South Carolina, to name just a few states. So it obviously varies quite dramatically depending on where you live in the country. And if you're working at a $7.25 an hour wage in somewhere in the U.S., that translates into about $1.30 per hour back in 1976 when I climbed onto the bottom rung of the work ladder and salary ladder that I've been ascending for the past 50 years. Also, if you're interested, there's a simple way to calculate your annual earnings based on your hourly wages, especially if you're a younger person or a university or college student and you're trying to figure out how things are going or how you're doing financially, and what your hourly wage translates into in terms of an annual salary. So it's quite simple. Basically, but the way I do it, you have to make a couple of assumptions. So we make the assumption that you're working the equivalent. Now, you may not be, but in order to figure out what your annual salary is, you just make the assumption that you're working a full-time job, say 40 hours per week, and that you're working for 50 weeks per year with 2 weeks off. And so if you're making $10 an hour, then you're going to multiply that by 2,000. So in effect, your salary would be about $20,000 per year. See? So it's pretty simple. Just do that with whatever your hourly wage is. Okay. And so if you're earning, $18 an hour as your current wage, you just double that figure and add 3 zeros. So that's roughly $36,000 per year. If you're making $25 an hour, that means you're earning about $50,000 per year. And so you need to really make about $50 an hour in order to earn that magical, mark of $100,000 per year. Obviously, that's way above minimum wage. But here's the thing. If you have a couple of children in Virginia, by the way, then that $100,000 a year salary, or just under $50 per hour, that's what's currently defined as a living wage in the state of Virginia in 2024. So if you're going to have children, and depending upon where you live, taking into consideration all of the cost of living expenses and housing especially, you need ideally to earn at least $40 an hour and probably closer to $50 an hour to make ends meet relatively comfortably, or what's called a living wage, depending on where you live in the country. So it's no wonder then that people, many people at least, are agitated or upset if inflation rates are higher and their salaries are not keeping pace and so on. And it's also not surprising then that so many people have just a bare minimum in savings, or they're in debt and would be really hard pressed to meet emergency expenses. So I've talked a little bit about that previously. I won't get into that today. So anyway, but the bottom line here is that it's a good thing to know that we're all mathematicians so that we can all figure out, exactly what we need in terms of minimum wages and in terms of our basic salary requirements. So we'll investigate the salary issues and adjustments for cost of living increases next week, both in the US and in Canada. And we'll continue to look at how math becomes vital for making sense out of our earnings and in terms of our aspirations for the future, whether personally or in terms of family planning or in terms of retirement down the road, no matter where you live. For now, may you and yours continue to create peace in your hearts, and peace in your lives, and nurture love in your hearts. And be sure to give someone a big hug today who really needs one. Hope to see you tomorrow.